Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar where we're looking at the global contracts environment and particularly the role of contract lifecycle management in global contracting today. And I am very pleased to be joined on this particular webinar. This is Tim Cummins from IACCM, and we also have two participants from Determine who we'll introduce in just a moment. But first of all, well, I'll introduce them in fact right. I'll do the agenda and then I'll introduce them. So first of all, I'm just going to spend a few minutes just giving a little bit of a point of view on trends in global contracting and a few comments out of our research and experience with our member organizations around the world. And I will then pass over to our friends at Determine, who will actually then take us through some of the practical implications and challenges of implementing contract lifecycle management from a field perspective, and discussing what they have observed as best practices, the sort of things that you can walk away with to share within your organization, since we know from our data that a very high proportion of international organizations have made one or another selection of contract lifecycle management, and that frequently they have failed to achieve global adoption. So it's great to have Determine with some real success stories. Certainly their reputation in the market has always been one of a user-friendly application, and that may be part of the secret sauce, I suspect. And when we get to the end, we'll do a Q&A. So, well, I've said who I am, and probably many of you are aware of our role here at IACCM, but more importantly joined today by Kyle Patel, who, as you can see, is a Senior Director of Contract Lifecycle Management Professional Services at Determine, and Konstantin Membrakis, who is the Vice President of Product Marketing. So, Konstantin, Kyle, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Okay,
so let's maybe get started with the content. And first of all, let's think about 2017. What does global look like? Well, not probably quite the same as it looked in 2016. But before we get to such a present day, let's also look a little bit at the history of global contracting and global contract lifecycle management, because I think it's important just to understand the elements of that past. It isn't such a long history because, to be honest, the first truly global multi-country agreements in many respects only started in the early 1990s. And they were, of course, driven by the networked economy, the networked world, the advances in technology, which in the early 1990s started to create things like the World Wide Web and networked organizations. And of course, as that networked world emerged, there were a growing number of large international corporations that wanted to be networked, and they discovered that the technology companies, by and large, couldn't support them because they weren't designed or organized to actually manage global projects. And I remember certainly in my years at IBM walking into the boardroom to demonstrate the complexity that our customers faced in contracting with two wheelbarrows full of agreements in 26 different languages, but we had simplified it. We'd given them a master signature agreement. Well, that wasn't, of course, a great way to do business. So we saw an environment where actually contracts and the inability to do contracting was a major inhibitor to globalization. In the early days, that was overcome by the creation of master agreements, where organizations would centrally make decisions and try to drive standardized terms and conditions across all of their business units. It met with a lot of local resistance because very often these things started to impact on some of the measurement and management systems, particularly the responsibility of local country general managers to generate profit. So there was a lot of concern about this centrally driven activity and the loss of power that it implied. the early versions certainly were sufficiently, in general at least, were sufficiently astute to take account of local legal requirements, but they certainly didn't care very much about local custom and practice. So if the central decision was 30-day payment terms, suddenly 30-day payment terms become a global norm. And it didn't matter that that really did cut across custom and practice in many countries around the world. Now, there was a big focus too in the mid-1990s as organizations began to implement enterprise resource planning, ERP systems on a global basis, and they suddenly saw standardization of contract terms as a great way to drive further cost reductions. I can remember, again, leading that project at IBM, that the goal ran into several hundreds of millions of dollars of savings each year just through standardization of terms and conditions. And of course, we were also driving a very new organizational design, taking out the old country infrastructure in the same way as it was, and instead creating things like global industry units, etc. So by the late 1990s, we began to see the early efforts at global automation of contract management, with some of the early players, and I know one of the antecedents from Determine was amongst those in its early days, but increasingly, particularly with the implementation of systems, local resistance tended to grow. So what we see is that the challenges over those years, and as we come forward to today, has been a tendency by major corporations, and that's perhaps particularly true of those based in the US, to ignore local variations, or at least to try to diminish them. So what are some of the things that are problematic when you're trying to globalize contract management in this way? Well, one thing certainly is around the overall legal structure of the organization. I've mentioned, if you have separate operating subsidiaries, then there are major tax and intercompany issues that are created if you start trying to mandate contract terms from the center, or indeed impose terms signed in one country onto another country. Obviously, you also need to be cognizant of jurisdictional issues, the differences of legal systems. So common law and civil law are quite different, and statutory law is a major difference. So in Germany, for example, or countries like Portugal and Spain, there are very different provisions from those that would be typical in common law countries, whether that's in terms of warranties or whether it's in terms of even things like the freedom to negotiate, which in a country like Portugal is really not recognized. Also, organizations ran into big conflicts over the clash between terms and conditions and local management and measurement systems. There are some jurisdictions, for example in France, where there is a need for local language to be used, which may, again, affect the enforceability of an agreement. And then, of course, we get down to the issues of custom and practice, which, although not legally required, may be commercially required, and you may ignore some of those customs and practices at your peril. And then, of course, we run into areas just of pure ignorance in not understanding various areas of things like withholding taxes and other principles that could really come back to bite you when you do global contracts. And the second point here is that disenfranchising of local staff has often had a negative impact. If you try to impose centrally driven systems and tools upon them, one of the things you find increases very often is the level of non-compliance, people operating outside the system, outside the standards, and that becoming increasingly invisible to the center. You also run the risk that creativity goes away. People feel disenfranchised, and as a result they feel that their views and their ideas are simply not welcome. And finally, of course, you do finish up, if you're not careful, with systems and contracts that are unresponsive to local market needs and which can create a local resistance and also give your competitors a real advantage. So those are, I think, the major components And as we come to the better way, a few brief comments from me on that. Today, streamlined contracting processes are absolutely key to competitiveness. Organizations need to be far more agile. They need to think much more, and leading-edge contracts and commercial groups are thinking far more about how do they empower good business decision-making as opposed to how do they impose central policies and practices. That's leading us more and more towards models of center-led organizations as opposed to centralized organizations. And those center-led organizations must be facilitated by common technology. They use norms and principles rather than rigid terms, so guidance, playbooks, term alternates, fallbacks, etc., which are published and available not only to country legal and contract staff, but increasingly out into the business units, which of course then makes the use of the system very attractive to those business units because it speeds up their ability to reach closure on their contracts. Also, these processes are much more sensitive to the local variations of terms and process, so there is far more fact-finding before things are imposed, and also an ongoing system of feedback to ensure that when things change, maybe there's a new local regulation, maybe there's a new competitor, then there is that flexibility, that ability to move fast and appropriately. Which of course leads us to the point that with this technology, you're increasingly able to manage risks through intelligence rather than mandate. So all, I think, critical points. It's been a long and hard journey in certainly terms of effort, if not necessarily in terms of time. So let's go and look at some real practical examples shared, as the introduction said, from the field. So let me hand over to you, Constantine.
Thank you for that introduction. Before we get started, I just kind of wanted to just do a brief introduction of Determine. For those of you not familiar with us, we are a global company that's focused in contract management and source to pay with clients globally all over the world and in almost every continent. And we have, users of our platform that represent thousands of users on the enterprise. We work closely with a rich partner network where we do a lot of these deployments on a global basis, including our own professional services folks like Cal. And then looking really at trying to manage technology in a way that is interconnected, modular, and really using the latest technologies for improving enterprise deployments. And the theme here is really around this global message that we have today. And as a global company, you can see that we have locations throughout the world. And with this, we are really trying to set a tone and set the stage for what it means to be dealing with global challenges, particularly in the areas of source to pay and contract management. So with that, let's jump into the core of the topic. And as Tim has kind of teed this up for us, the idea of the challenge is certainly a large one. Considering that 80% of business transactions are tied to contracts, rolling out a contract lifecycle management solution globally introduces really, again, a series of these unique challenges that Tim mentioned. And contracts really need to conform to both corporate standards and local requirements. Organizations need to maintain visibility to really keep key contract data required to effectively comply with the internal mandates and the governmental regulations while still really trying to optimize revenues and minimize costs. So the question is really how does an organization even begin to roll out software on such a large scale? And for those of us that have been involved with these types of projects, we can see, the acronyms of knowing that we're starting maybe in North America or going to EMEA or maybe trying to roll out to APAC or Latin America, and knowing that all these different factors from legal jurisdictions to the different contracts to the employee or company subsidiaries to customers and suppliers and the counterparties involved, all having a huge factor on how we want to deploy these contracts. Now, what we also see is that there are also some compelling events that are certainly having a huge impact on what we're trying to do when we're rolling these out. So simply speaking, we're not just dealing with the internal challenges of a company and trying to even speak together with the same language and having the same goals, but we're dealing with certain challenges that are happening across the world. One major one that we've come across, and is something that everybody's become aware of, particularly with the likes of the talks about what's happening with Apple and various companies around tax issues, is the idea around tax regime differences. So understanding tax laws and tax rates for revenue recognition and tax reporting is really important as it relates to contract management. And this has had a huge impact on how multinationals are basing things like their headquarters in certain countries and being lured by certain special tax conditions, etc. Understanding how to keep that information separate and knowing how you need to manage that within your contract is a critical one, particularly because of some of these issues that are coming up with regards to these tax conditions like we're hearing about in Ireland and Luxembourg with some pretty global, big global names. Another area that we are hearing quite a bit of information about and understanding contract management is the change in administration. All of us are aware of the recent elections that happened in the United States with the President-elect Trump going to be inaugurated here shortly, and as a result we know in the administration that there's a lot of talk about changing the way policy and regulations like Dodd-Frank are happening, and as a result of that, how are we within a global setting able to manage our contracts to accommodate whether they're regional or national or international regulations that would have an impact based on the changes that are happening within administrations in a political and in a geopolitical or geoeconomic setting. And in similar vein, we know that we understand the future and the impact of Brexit and the implications of the movement of people and products and money around the world. As we can clearly see, is it might be too early to understand and what we see from the change happening with regard to Brexit, but understanding the impact of this or the potential impact is something that organizations will need to consider and investigate in areas like force majeure clauses to renegotiate contracts that are impacted by the changes that are going to happen with regard to Brexit. Finally, another one in direct connection to the Brexit event is market volatility. Recent months have shown some of the most volatility in specific currencies like the British pound, or volatility in markets in underlying areas and commodities, etc. And if a contract is pegged to, say, the euro or the pound sterling, we need to be aware of the swings in the markets following these negotiations that are happening, and parties may want to renegotiate or include or reprice or switch currency clauses in their contracts. Finally, as a result of the recent shift, as we know earlier in 2016, from safe harbor to the safe harbor laws between the United States and EU to the Privacy Shield, and the also coming of the EU GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation that will be starting in May 25th, 28, we need to be aware of how data is being managed and how that information is being stored within the cloud and in the various servers that are being managed for them, and understanding the unique standards for these regions, but also even understanding the unique standards for countries like Russia, where they may have their own provisions that are specific to their country regulations. So with that, we see that rolling out a contract lifecycle system globally introduces a series of unique challenges that we need to be aware of, and we really want to understand the context of that. So here are just some points that we want to make before we jump into some of the specific use cases that companies that are running on our technology have come up with. So number one, and maybe a best practice, is knowing that countries really need to conform to corporate standards and businesses locally. This is an important aspect, and knowing, again, to some of the points that Tim made, that we need to be aware of local laws and knowing how to conform to them, but also knowing how that impacts wider corporate standards and business requirements as it relates to corporate social responsibility or ethics or wider aspects that could impact a company's reputation if not handled properly. Number two, organizations here, that as we can see, need to maintain visibility to key contract data required to effectively comply with the internal mandates that they have. So having access to that contract data globally, or having it segmented in a way that those who are in the know or need to know have access to that information to be able to make the proper decisions. Finally, as we can see, corporations need to balance the regional government regulations while still trying to optimize revenues and minimize cost. And as I had shared in the earlier examples, and particularly dealing with the currency fluctuations or dealing with changes in regime or political situations, understanding how to optimize those revenues or minimize costs and having the flexibility to do that within a contract platform or contract system certainly provides a competitive advantage, particularly when you're trying to manage against these on a global basis across many different divisions or different business units. Finally, and as Tim hinted at, is understanding the culture and the experience with past global technologies and efforts or other engagements. Sometimes past trials or errors of these could have a huge impact on the success of rolling out the technology and deciding where you may want to start your effort first, and deciding what continent might be the right or most appropriate one, knowing the readiness of the organizations globally in those different business units for deploying to those locations, considering past experiences, or knowing what the overall strategy of the contract lifecycle management solution is. And particularly in our experiences, we know, and Cal will talk to some of this as well today on the call, is knowing that, you know, oftentimes starting the U.S. might be a smart approach, but then knowing you may want to start in a different European country or Latin America, but learning off of the lessons of the initial deployment. So with that, what I want to do is really share with you 4, I guess, unique experiences in having spoken with some of our largest global clients. And I can't really share the names of these organizations because of our NDA with them, but what I can do is glean for you some of the experiences and some of the specific use cases of what these organizations have gone through. And many of the companies that we're working with, they're dealing with multiple deployments across many different regions. So just like those regions that I showed before, they're dealing with a staggered rollout to EMEA, then to Latin America and APAC. They're dealing with multiple business units and dealing with hundreds of users with several different contract types that would include anything from procurement to sales to different types of other legal agreements. So with that, what we could see is 4 stories that came across that we had from the field in deploying contracts globally. One was a situation that we came across with one of our global customers with regard to security and permissions by country. A second was related to approvals and contract execution that was specifically involved with e-signatures. A third was with regard to language and metadata requirements, and a fourth it relates to managing international currencies. So let's take a look at these 4 situations and then see what we could take away from them. First of all, so let's talk a little bit about security permissions by country and tax laws. In this situation, our client was talking to us about a global rollout where they were talking about the different rules and regulations between the U.S. and Europe. And the first aspect of what they did was knowing that at some point the attorneys were not able to share contracts between different countries. And the specific example our client gave us was that they, having their headquarters in a European location, they knew that they had to have access to contracts based on the way they're organized on a tax basis for headquarters, but having to have restrictions to other countries where those countries, the attorneys in those countries may not need to have access to those contracts, but knowing that the headquarters have to have that information. So this is one thing that they said that in the interview that we had with them, that the North America team, which is the organization that was starting the deployment for the contracts, was really not prepared for in advance, and was something that, as Tim had mentioned, was something that they found out kind of after the fact and realized that they needed to make adjustments in order to effectively manage the deployment to the various business units in Europe where they were rolling out the contracts. So one of the things that I was talking to with one of our professional services consultants was that the initial process was really this kind of development of a swivel chair process, where you basically thought, well, this is the way we did it here in North America, let's pass that on and copy that template and make sure that it works in Europe. And what we discovered, again, was when we were mapping out our user acceptance processes in full detail, we realized that we couldn't organize users that had access in quite the same way. So as a result, one of the things that we learned as part of doing the global deployment was that we had to revamp and to expand our security and permission setup for certain users that were in the headquarters in Europe, and also change the security and permission setup for those that were in other European countries that weren't supposed to have access to the contracts with neighboring countries, or countries that were not a part of the commercial relationship that might have been established in a contract outside of their country. So one of the things that we had to do was really eliminate some of the users that would fall under these restrictions, and that we also had to literally drill down into the actual entity within each country and make sure that we knew which users this impacted, and go back and do a complete remapping of that. So this is, a perfect example of, how when you're rolling out the differences between doing something where you might have experienced it in North America, but then knowing in Europe that those things had to change because of the way the organization was set up. So what I'm going to do here is take a second and pass this on to Cal, and as part of his role, see if you have any thoughts or anything we could take away from this particular experience, Cal, on what we experienced in the field.
Specifically regarding the security and permissions by country, Constantine, is that what you're referring to?
Sure. Yes.
Yes. So all the different countries have their own very specific tax laws and security requirements. And what we're able to do in the system through our role-based security is provide the right level of contract visibility that's required, so that one region has access to the contracts that they require. So we're able to, through the application, create specific domains or levels of security that's needed by the different countries.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Cal. One of the other areas that we came across, again, as part of these stories, was really around the notion of approvals and contract execution. And the example that we have here is around e-signatures. So what we found here in this case with this one client was that we saw that, again, in this case, we deployed globally with the U.S., and the U.S. group had to be made aware of all of the contracts in the system. And one of the things that we found was that in Europe, we are starting to get set up with DocuSign. So we are trying to use e-signatures and business objects in language. And as part of the deployment, we became aware that using DocuSign was a separate system from the actual CLM, so that we integrate with DocuSign as part of our platform with Determine, and understanding then is where did the data need to reside. And a lot of this has to do with what I was talking about earlier with regard to the privacy shield and the new laws that are happening in the EU, and making sure that we were compliant with those requirements. So part of this had to do not only with the data, but also knowing that they wanted to have those contracts set up in DocuSign in language with regard to business objects. So when they were first starting out today, they said that, well, all the documents today are running through the North American server. So whenever a CLM, a document was being stored, it was being stored on the server. When it was going through the envelope in DocuSign, again, those servers in the North America was where those documents were stored. However, once the document was tagged to the recipient and signed and back into the CLM application, docs could then technically be deleted from one system because the actual executed document then was residing within the CLM system. But because of the regulation that was required in terms of having the data in both Europe and North America, they had to make adjustments to in understanding how do we ensure that we're compliant with these regulations. So basically what they did was that they ensured that DocuSign was also storing the docs with the executions for contracts being generated between entities within the European Union, and as a result they were having to allow for accounts in both the European Union and the North America account to make sure that they were accommodating for these requirements and being compliant for having the data. Furthermore, not only is this something now that is challenging with regard to North America and Europe as the EU, but the organization is now considering about rolling out to other regions like in Russia. And as a result, they're finding out that there are certain data restrictions specifically within Russia that they have to be aware of, and as they start to deploy there, they will be having to deal with the same type of challenges of understanding where the data needs to reside and what they need to do to try to accommodate the data requirements from a server standpoint. So this is just, again, another example here. So approval and contract execution. Cal, did you have any thoughts on this one with regard to the project experience on the DocuSign?
Yeah, absolutely. And just Constantine, as you were mentioning, depending on what's in the contract and how it's laid out, the privacy issues, some of the contracts need to flow through the European servers, right? We've seen in the field that the data needs to remain within EU and not flow through North America. So we've been working with the specific customers to ensure that the contract flows through to the signers and it's going through the European servers. Some of our customers we've also seen purge out the documents from DocuSign or the e-signature service provider after the contract is signed, so that those contracts are not don't remain in the e-signature vendors repositories. And you know, a lot of times with countries, as you mentioned, Constantine, the documents within those countries need to reside there, and so you know, setting up of the e-signature DocuSign servers assists with the level of security that's needed to be met.
Thanks, Cal. A third example, as I mentioned, was really one in terms of deploying in the field, was really related to languages and metadata. And one of the things that we see here is this goes specifically to the requirement of making sure that a regional aspect is being respected as part of a global deployment. So one of the things that we see here is that companies that are bringing on some of the worldwide vision, you know, English is always, again, sometimes the de facto language or the de facto example of the country, of the working language. But what we can see is that when there are times when we need to go beyond that and go to specific regional requirements in places specifically like Russia, or when we have a large user base in places like Mexico, they need to build their contracts out in language. And this is becoming a much bigger play for us in hearing what organizations are trying to do. And maybe back a few years ago, you know, that might have been more acceptable to have the English version, but we're seeing increasingly the regional aspect becoming a big part of why organizations are trying to adopt and really get the users to use their system globally in language. So the goal here, you know, and that we're finding that a few of our clients are sharing with us, is taking well-working business objects as well as workflow, and actually going through a very vigorous process to translate that into language and using more of those metadata fields. So as we know and experience from CLM, you know, going through the metadata process and knowing what tags we want to translate natively in language and having actual native speakers doing that process will certainly enable and improve the deployment and usage of the CLM, and need to think through the type of metadata that's being used, what type of clauses, what type of metadata do we want to track globally, how much do we want to take on in this process, and then be able to apply scalability and flexibility for the users internally, but also not forgetting often time, particularly for procurement contracts, about the suppliers that will be involved in working and integrating through the process through a lot of collaboration that's enabled when you're dealing with both the repository and authoring as well as the execution on the back end with e-signatures. So one of the things that we've seen, and in particular a client that shared with me was one of our large clients is saying that now they're planning on deploying in Japanese. So inherently you're dealing with not only going beyond Latin-based characters or Cyrillic and dealing with language as far as having characters that are in Asian languages and having to have a QA in the regional language. So the initial experience that our client is that the initial rollout in doing Japanese was that they had they put the Japanese in and translated the metadata on a regional basis, but then going to the Japanese users and then making sure that they're using the language, the simplified Japanese that they're trying to use based on the native speakers as well from a QA perspective. So overall, again, the main takeaway for us from here is that by having the regional users actively involved in knowing not only the language but the maybe the dialect or the regional nuances, improves the efficiency for searching with regard to business objects and repositories and the workflow, and improves the overall user experience in terms of getting users to adopt to the CLM solution. The last one, and probably maybe the easiest one, is the one that we talk about with regard to currency. So as I talked about, the fluctuations in currencies being a major thing that organizations need to be aware of in terms of what currency they're drafting their contracts in, how they're managing that from a tax perspective. And from our experience in most cases, and again, often coming from a North American perspective, is we sort of seen that most try to work or forced to work in the US dollar basis, particularly if you're dealing with a US-based organization, but dealing with it globally. We also see that then if they're not working in US, there needs to be the accommodation within the CLM tool to be able to configure and to calculate appropriately with the proper currency conversion based on how the accounting standards are being set in terms of reporting and when those currencies are taking into effect. And what we've done and our clients have done is have requirement sessions to have the customer tell us what that is and how that works with accounting and financial requirements, so that we're able to accommodate those currency and reporting requirements internally to reflect those proper values. The other thing, again, is managing multiple currencies for transactions and accounting and financial reporting really takes a lot of collaboration, and it's an important aspect to making sure you have a successful rollout for managing for both financial users as well as for procurement and others that are trying to track those changes. And finally, having flexibility in entering exchange rates into the system from an automatic data feed or manually entering those values is an important flexibility that needs to be built into a CLM tool. So why don't we then move on then to the last slide here and just really generally kind of a primer overall for a global CLM deployment and requirement. So, these again, some of these are just the 4 that we brought out. It's not definitely a complete list, but it's certainly a list that is given us from those real-world scenarios that we hear in the field and are things that Cal and his team are dealing with on a daily basis when we are doing it. So, a primer for considering then global CLM technology. What things you need to think about if you're going to take this endeavor on? What does a full CLM technology platform need to have? So first of all, one of the most important things we've experienced is having full support for legacy globalization, IT infrastructures and replications of solutions from an IT perspective. Having that will ensure that you're going to be successful. Another one is with regard to having global visibility and reporting across all the contract metadata in all languages and currencies. So what this does is, again, ensure that those that are in the know or need to know have access to the reporting that they have, and being able to accommodate those local users in the regional language, in the metadata, and the currencies that are needed certainly helps them in facilitating in the usage of the tool. Another aspect is really having the tight controls for business practices, regulatory compliance, and maverick spending. As I had mentioned, in the 2 scenarios with regard to the DocuSign situation as well as the situation with the tax laws, a lot of that has to do with even being proactive. And again, in some of the news that we're hearing with regard to some of these challenges that companies like Apple or others are having with regard to tax reporting and those challenges, in talking with our clients, it's saying, hey, we're trying to be preventative here and being the most accurate as we can, and making sure that we're creating tight controls within our system and preventing any issue or challenge in an audit to make sure that we're compliant on a regulatory basis, ensuring best practices, and also preventing any kind of maverick spending that might also be happening as a result if we're not tracking those properly. Finally, again, having the presentation of repository metadata in any language, we kind of covered that. And then language specific and end user interfaces. Again, this is becoming much more of a scheme for us, particularly as we're dealing more with countries in the APAC region, having organizations rolling out to many more, a lot more users. And in our experience, one of the areas that we're seeing is the idea of having self-service contract management. So what we're seeing is as organizations now are deploying contract management in a wider basis and going to more of an end user requirement rather than focusing on, say, tens or hundreds of users, actually having access of contracts to thousands of users. This becomes ever more important, particularly then for those users that are in those regions that may not have English as a first language and need to have access to contracts for then going through their process and providing some kind of self-service like non-disclosure agreements or other simpler processes that you may not want to have legal or a contract managers involved. So that's another example of why this has become so important. Finally, having full support for all currencies and time and date formats. I can't tell you how often, particularly here, even our personal experience at Determine, where we're dealing with a lot of our colleagues are in France and dealing with the time and date format and knowing what the order of the date is. Are we using European format? Are we using US format in terms of time, military, etc.? So being able to support and accommodate those certainly has a huge impact. And again, from a cultural perspective in knowing that you're accommodating those needs. Being able to be fast and easy in terms of configurations of fields, that's really another important aspect of being able to accommodate maybe a specific requirement that happens as a result of a specific need. And then finally, seamless replication of data across multiple applications and instances and multiple databases. Then in the end, the last thing that I could say is, again, finally, a departmental level administration capability and knowing that, again, the nuances of having what data needs to be accessed where and being able to manage those nuances is an important aspect for managing some of the regulations and other things and being proactive. So, so again, these are some main takeaways of us in terms of being a primer for global CLM, and hopefully we have imparted just some of the things, particularly if you're thinking on going on this process, stepping out on a global deployment for CLM, or even if you've done this once before and you're taking some of the lessons learned. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to, again, having an open forum in terms of some of the questions here in the last 10 minutes to see maybe if we can impart some knowledge on some areas that we maybe didn't address that you were expecting, or maybe giving you some more details on some of the things that we shared on the webinar today. So, so with that, Tim, are you ready for some questions?
Certainly am.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Cal? Okay,
yes,
Cal.
yes, I am.
Okay,
yes,
okay, sorry, I said the delay. All right, so let's see if we have some of the questions. So if we're looking at a couple of them, one of those that came across was with regard to, I think, global deployment. So one of the question was what does a typical deployment look like for a global CLM, so contract management? How long typically does a global deployment take? What should we start with in terms of repository, authoring, etc.? So really the question is, you know, is there a particular best practice that we've learned here at Determine with starting in one place and going somewhere, and then also deciding on maturity of how far do you go with a global deployment given, you know, some of the nuances? So I guess I'm going to ask Cal, I'm going to ask you this, and maybe Tim, if you have some thoughts on that question too, that would be good.
Yeah, fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, there's multiple approaches that can be used for successful global deployments that fit best for the organization. One of the best practices that we've realized is to start in a phased approach. For example, you would start with one region, maybe in North America or EMEA, using the repository functionality, which is the centralized database for the contracts. Once you've successfully implemented to this one region, is to then scale that out to the other regions. That can be done in conjunction to overall reduce the global duration. In regards to the overall implementation time frame, I would say that the initial region that's being addressed, it would take about 3 months in duration, and I have seen that a full global deploy can take approximately 6 months. So the first region takes the longest duration of time. From there, you can parallel task and reduce and deploy to the global regions, probably within the 3 to 6 month duration. After the repository is up and running, that's when you would begin to implement some of the full lifecycle capabilities, such as contract authoring and redlining and so forth. So start small, and you can very quickly scale to a global deployment.
Okay. Tim, I don't know from the IACCM perspective in terms of some of the members in the community, have they ever had, you know, have they ever shared some of that with you with regard to, you know, how they were successful?
Yes, absolutely. We've actually had quite a few roundtables on software deployments generally. I think just briefly, identifying local champions, of course, can be really important. If you haven't got a local advocate and a local sponsor, you're going to struggle. I I think doing some sort of level of need and complexity analysis. So which regions or countries can benefit most from all of this, but equally, what's their portfolio? How complex will it be for them to undertake implementation? How mature are they in terms of software understanding, etc., would be another factor. Mm-hmm. It's really important to have some early successes to point to. And I think in terms of the question of do you focus on repository or redlining, or do you focus on the end users, etc., again, that has that need to really have an appreciation of where the pain points are in local geographies, because they will vary, and if you just assume one size fits all, that assumption is going to probably undermine your success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Those are some good points. That leads me to another question here that we got on the panel, which was, and I think you hinted at this, Tim, is in your experience, who are the most important stakeholders that need to be involved, other than those that are on a project team? So I don't know. I mean, Cal. I mean, from our experience, what, if you had to name one or two stakeholders that need to really be involved, would you say the legal? I mean, who are the most important that make sure that you have success? Or are there some often unnamed stakeholders that people forget about that, end up becoming one of the most important parts of the team for getting these global deployments to work?
Yeah, sure. The couple that really stand out, you would need global sponsors, executives that can drive the global changes, right? Because one of the key objectives that I've seen is standardizing processes that requires change management. So I think somebody who can actually make these sponsorship level decisions is very important to influence those changes. The other stakeholder that's really critical to global deployments is the business SMEs, the subject matter experts. Again, as we standardize processes, these are the subject matter experts, preferably locally, that are able to speak the same language and assist the different regions or countries to start, standardizing their processes.
Mm-hmm. Would we say, is there a best practice to do that? Because, in my conversations with some of our clients, and again, Tim, I'd love to get your feedback. I think that part of the challenge is there's so many things to be aware of and regulations, and often, and I think, Tim, you hinted at this, is that, maybe in the U.S. we may not be as aware, so it's something that we might put under the table and not be concerned about it, but then later finding out it has a huge impact on, the fact of how we need to configure and deploy the solution. Is there, have we ever come across any kind of best practices? I mean, obviously, other than maybe leveraging some of this stuff that you guys put out there, at IACCM and putting in repository, what other kind of things internally on the project that we've come up with? Is there any kind of just way to share that, or just make people aware of how they need to do that, or is that just kind of maybe on a trial and error because you find out as you need to know? You don't know what you don't know. I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer to that.
Yeah, I think there are two components to the points you were raising there, Konstantin. One, so on the knowledge issue, one of the things that, to be honest, I found particularly successful was actually allocating out work. So don't try and do it all from the center. Again, we talked about center-led. Take that center-led philosophy. There is a focal point, if you like. There's a coordination point, but that doesn't mean it has to do everything. So get people engaged. Give them a sense of ownership and belonging in this overall project. There's no greater way to guarantee success than involving people. If you're simply trying to enforce and impose something on them, then of course they remain silent. They don't talk about the problems because they want you to fail. So The successful projects I've seen have been where workload has been allocated out. You know, put the people in France in charge of a fact-finding mission around what needs to be different, because they'll be the most vocal about the ones who will say, oh, nothing will work, we're completely different here, nothing is practical. So give them the task of finding out what is practical. And suddenly you find a very, very different attitude. I think on the second side of other stakeholders, it depends what you're trying to do. If all you want is very expensive database of agreements, then just involve the legal groups. They'll be really good at helping you to implement a repository. But if you actually want something that's going to drive business efficiency and give you greater ability to manage your contracts well, then it's critical to involve stakeholders out of your user groups, because it's their adoption that's going to be critical. And interestingly, of course, as I'm sure you know, that's more and more of the thinking in IT projects generally, that actually the IT department is the problem, not the answer.
Yeah, it's a good point. That's a good point. I guess, I don't know, Cal, do you have anything as we kind of finish this off here at the top of the hour, any other thoughts or points on that specific question on stakeholders?
No, I mean, just to summarize it, there's a lot of commonalities in business processes that we're trying to implement, and so stakeholders are very critical in making sure that there's a certain level of sharing of information across the different regions and countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. And with that, I thank everybody. We are at the top of the hour. I want to thank Tim for joining us here with this webinar, and Cal, thank you for also being a part of the webinar. And with that, we'd like to close us off and look forward to doing more of these in the future in 2017. Thank you and have a great day.